But with respect to Justin Trudeau, I don't feel he's a prime minister in the real sense. One of the things I worry about is virtual politics being conducted in virtual space as distinct from real political democratic space. And I get a feeling that Justin Trudeau is a former drama teacher playing the role of prime minister as distinct from being a prime minister. I think we don't have a finance minister. I think we have a virtual prime minister, a finance minister. We have a well-meaning journalist, perhaps, but playing the role of finance minister. Nothing in her background that would suggest a grasp of public finance or the economy or anything else. And I worry about us getting into a virtual politics that is just not the real thing, that the country doesn't have a real prime minister, doesn't have a real finance minister. And one of the analogies that's come home to me on this, Sandra and I watch some of these medical shows on TV, the Good Doctor, The Resident, Chicago Med, there's a bunch of them. And those actors are very, very good at playing the role of doctors and nurses. I mean, they're charismatic, they talk, they show them in the operating room doing something with somebody's liver and putting it in a tray, like you would think these are real doctors. But they're actors playing the role very, very well. But if you were ill, and you've been through this, would you want one of them to actually operate on you? Or would you want the real thing? Even if the real thing, maybe that doctor's not charismatic, or he's got a wart on his nose, or there's something wrong, but he knows how to do the real thing. And I think the country's in danger of being governed in this virtual space as distinct from the actual space. So that I don't think of Justin Trudeau as a real prime minister. The second thing is I worry that he is guided by ideologies that have little or nothing to do with Canada. This embracing of critical race theory is not a Canadian-rooted theory or philosophy.
Well, he has stated publicly, as far as I understand, that Canada doesn't really have a culture.
Well, yeah, so that may be. And so, but he's importing these theories basically from the United States. The critical race theory, identity politics, wokeism, and cancel culture. And particularly Western Canada does not see that as even Canadian. Don't see it as Canadians. Our prime minister is guided by some philosophy, basically the fact that the reaction to Black Lives Matter, which is understandably the kind of issue it is in the United States, but to just import that here, if you want to get off on racial discrimination, surely the emphasis here should have been on the Indian Act and the Indigenous and Aboriginal population. So the fact that we have a virtual prime minister, not a real prime minister, and one guided by ideologies that, in my view, are not Canadian, is a reason enough for his replacement. And I think there's backroom people in the Liberal Party that will concede, never on in the public arena, that Justin Trudeau is not the sharpest knife in the political kitchen, and that Mark Carney has a far better grasp of all this stuff. He's not reading off a script when he does it. And that, but if you're headed for Liberal leadership under Mark Carney, then all these things, particularly this ideological orientation, is liable to get deeper and worse rather than better. A lot of Western Canadians can't understand why Trudeau just falls all over himself to be recognized in Washington and Beijing and the Davos crowd, and makes no effort to bolster his fortunes in Winnipeg or Regina or Edmonton or Calgary. We know they're not as dramatic places as Washington and Beijing, but this is your own country, and you're the prime minister of that part of the country.
So what do you think it is on the Conservative side that's not putting up a sufficient, let's say, offense or defense against this? Or do you think the tide will turn in the next election? It doesn't look like a foregone conclusion to me. That
comes back to what we've talked about before. I think conservatism needs to be rejuvenated by some of these things we've talked about, by a realignment, by adopting a realistic position on the environment, by offering an alternative on the poverty question, on dealing with balance. I think the Conservatives could champion balance as a very major part of their position. What's the balance between health protection and civil rights protection? What's the balance between economy and the environment? Balance used to be a fundamental political characteristic Canadian. That joke about why did the Canadian cross the road to get to the middle, and not just a middle that's a meaningless compromise, but a substantive middle that you could stand on. I think if the Conservatives can do that sort of thing, they could offer a principled alternative to the Liberals. But at present, that's not developing. Hopefully, it might, from my standpoint, under Aaron O'Toole, but it's not developing yet. And what the Conservatives federal party has to watch is it has to address this Western alienation. It's got a huge base in Western Canada, but it's got to.
Do you see any signs of that happening? And it looks to me like the Conservatives over recent years have struggled, certainly on the charisma end of the leadership spectrum. And that seems to be at least in part why Trudeau was able to make the inroads that he made. I mean, maybe people believed it was time for a change as well, because...
Yeah, 9 years is often the lifespan. Well, I think the jury's still out on Aaron O'Toole. There's still opportunity, but time is getting short. And as I say, I think there's a need for revitalizing conservatism at the federal level. And I try and list in that book, I try and list some of those things that can be done. I don't know whether the country has to get into real, even deeper trouble than it is now. I mean, it's in trouble. It's in trouble on the economy. It's in trouble on the international stage. It's not respected. Whether things have to get worse before they can get better. My father dealt with 4 federal administrations. Mackenzie King, during the latter part of the Depression and the war, Louis Saint Laurent, John Diefenbaker, and Lester Pearson. And he said the strongest federal cabinet he dealt with, and he didn't agree with everything they did by any stretch of the imagination, was Mackenzie King's war cabinet. When the country got into a war or the prospect of a war, the leaders could go to somebody, King could go to Saint Laurent, who was a high-powered constitutional lawyer in Quebec with no idea of getting into federal politics. So you have to come, the country's in trouble. C.D. Howe was a business guy who normally would not have stayed in politics the length of time that he did, but Howe could go to business people and say, you are coming to Ottawa to help organize wartime production. And when they asked, what are you going to pay me? He said, I'll pay you $1 a year. And they came. And I sometimes wonder if things have to get to that point where you can go to some of these people that could make a much greater contribution than what we've got there now and say, look, your country is, I don't care what you're doing academically or business-wise, you've got to come. You've got to run for public office and offer an alternative. But it's a shame that you have to get to that.
So what do you think are the fundamental issues that face Canadians at the moment? What you said the country is in trouble in some ways.
Well, I think one is this national unity problem. I don't think particularly Central Canada understands the depth of this Western alienation.
Again.
Yeah, and if you ever had a dual separatist movement, Quebec moving in that direction and the West moving at the same time, you'd tear the country apart. I don't think there's an appreciation by the Laurentian elites that old model of Canada is not sufficient for the 21st century. So and Canadians can never take national unity for granted. Our country's too big and too diverse to just hope it's going to hang together. So that's one issue. The second is the fiscal issue. These astronomical deficits and debts, and no even recognition that this could be a problem. When we were crusading against unbalanced budget in the 1990s, the Liberals didn't oppose the ultimate objective. So eventually you got to balance the budget, but you guys are going too fast, or you're doing it the wrong way, or you're cutting it. But they didn't oppose the ultimate objective. But today it's not even stated as an objective. They bought into this new monetary theory that you can overspend and print money, and as long as it doesn't seem to register in terms of immediate inflation, you can do it ad infinitum. And so I think restoring the fiscal health of the country is going to be an enormous challenge. And I don't know, whoever does that is going to face a terrible task, because it can't be done as quickly as it should be or could be without causing enormous pain. And then our relations with the rest of the world, I think they've deteriorated under Trudeau. This almost pathetic desire to be recognized by the world elites, the Davos crowd, the Washington crowd, and in Beijing, I think is a dangerous thing. I think on the international stage, the big 21st century competition is between the state-directed democracy as promoted by the Communist Party and government of China and citizen-directed democracy as traditionally practiced in the West, but which is in a lot of trouble, and state-directed capitalism and they call it capitalism, state-directed capitalism versus market-driven capitalism, the Western version. I think the West needs strong ideological leadership on those two fronts, and we're certainly not getting that from hardly any Western leader, let alone Justin Trudeau. I don't want to get off on the China thing, but I went to China several times. I went to China once as the official leader of the opposition. I got to know some of these people in the International Liaison Department of the Communist Party, which is the party's foreign affairs department that establishes relationships with political parties all over the world. And these are the guys that meet you at the airport, and they have the standard question: is there somebody else? It's all been planned out, but is there somebody else you'd like to see, or some other place you want to go? And so I knew one of these fellows well enough to pull his leg. So I said, yes, I would like to meet my equivalent. I would like to meet the leader of the official opposition in China. So he goes away and huddles with his officials and comes back and says, we think if there is such a guy, he's in jail, or he should be. But then he got serious. He said, the closest thing to you is that Martin Lee in Hong Kong, who is the leader of the Democratic faction in Hong Kong. But on all my trips there, everyone from the person driving the bus to the Politburo member hammered away on those two themes. Our state-directed democracy is superior to your fuzzy, whatever that kind of democracy is that you have, and our state-directed capitalism, which has produced growth rates of 12%, 8%, 10%, is superior to your market-driven capitalism, and we will beat you on both those fronts. And they are making yards on that internationally. And so I think there's leadership needed in the Western world. Hopefully Canada could provide some of it to counter that, which means strengthening our version of democracy and strengthening our practice of market-based capitalism.
Do you think the CCP and its machination, so to speak, does pose an economic threat to Canada? Or do you think that the deficiencies of their system will eventually manifest themselves once it's easy to have growth rates of 10% when you're starting from zero, essentially. And so...
Well, I personally believe that there are fundamental weaknesses in that state-directed everything. On that subject, like the last time I went to China, I went after I was out of the parliament. I knew some of these people in the International Liaison Department. I said, because I was on this theme of training our politicians, I said, I want to visit 3 of your main training facilities for Communist Party officials. I didn't know if they'd agree or not, but sure, they said, sure. So I went and I visited 3 of these complexes for training Communist Party officials, and they are impressive. Now, of course, you got to attend. You don't have an option of not attending. So but they offered 5 major courses. One of the major ones was military, still today, 20% military. To rise to the top, you had to serve in several different districts. You can't just spend your entire political life in one district. You had to be, if you wanted to get to the national level, you had to serve in different districts. You had to serve at different levels, municipal or state, provincial, before you could get to the national. You had to come back every 5 years for a 6-month refresher course at these training facilities, which are like university campuses with buildings and training facilities, think tanks, and very frighteningly impressive when you compared it with our haphazard way of preparing people for public life.